Martin had always been a bit of a troublemaker. Growing up in a small town where everyone looked the same and thought the same, he'd never really been challenged on his views. Now, on his first trip to London, he walked with his chest puffed out, feeling like he owned the place. "This is going to be sick," he told his friends as they approached Buckingham Palace. The crowd was thick with tourists, everyone snapping photos and pointing at the famous building. That's when Martin spotted him. A tall, black soldier standing perfectly still in his red coat and tall bearskin hat. Lance Corporal James Okonkwo stood at his post, face forward, not blinking, not moving. He was like a statue, except for the occasional slight movement of his chest as he breathed. "Watch this," Martin whispered to his friends. He broke away from the group and moved closer to the barrier. The day was hot, and James had been standing for hours already. Sweat trickled down his back under the heavy uniform, but his face showed nothing. 6 years in the army had taught him discipline. 2 tours of duty had taught him patience. Being selected for the Queen's Guard had been the proudest moment of his family's life. Martin leaned over the rope barrier. "Hey mate, can you smile for a photo?" he called out. James didn't move a muscle. Not even his eyes shifted. "He can't hear you," a woman nearby said. "They're not allowed to react." This only encouraged Martin. He'd had a few beers at lunch, and the lack of response felt like a challenge. "Maybe he doesn't speak English," he said loudly, looking around for approval from the crowd. A few people started to back away, uncomfortable. Martin's friends shifted nervously. "Come on, let's go," one of them said, pulling at Martin's sleeve. But Martin was just getting started. He ducked under the rope. "I just want to see if he's real," he said, stepping closer. The crowd gasped. Someone whispered about calling security. James saw everything from the corner of his eye, but his training held firm. His mind flashed to his grandfather, who had also served in the British Army, facing much worse than this fool. Martin was now just feet away. "What's wrong?" "Cat got your tongue," he taunted, his words turning ugly with prejudice. "They'll really let anyone wear the uniform these days, huh?" The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Phone cameras pointed at the scene. Martin, feeling emboldened by the attention, reached out his hand toward James's uniform. That was the line. In one smooth, practiced movement, James stamped his foot hard against the pavement. The sound cracked like a whip. He swung his rifle to position, pointing it directly at Martin. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." James's voice boomed across the courtyard, deep and commanding. Martin's face drained of color. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on his backside. The crowd gasped, then a few people clapped. Within seconds, 2 palace police officers appeared, lifting Martin by his arms. "You can't do that," Martin protested, his bravado evaporating. "Actually, sir, interfering with the Queen's Guard is an offense," one officer explained calmly. "We'll need you to come with us." As Martin was led away, James resumed his position, perfectly still once more. But there was the faintest hint of satisfaction in his eyes, visible only to those who looked very closely. The crowd began to disperse, but not before many nodded respectfully toward the guardsmen who had handled the situation with such perfect composure. Martin's heart was still pounding as the police officers led him through a side door of the palace grounds. He hadn't expected things to go this way. In his mind, the guard was supposed to just stand there and take it. That's what they were famous for, right? Their stillness. "I was just having a laugh," Martin mumbled as they brought him into a small office. "Sir, the Queen's Guard are active-duty soldiers, not street performers," the older officer explained, his voice tired like he'd given this speech before. Lance Corporal Okonkwo followed proper protocol. "You're lucky he didn't consider you a serious threat." Martin slumped in his chair. Outside, he could hear his friends arguing with another officer, trying to find out what would happen to him. Meanwhile, the video was already spreading. A Japanese tourist had captured the whole thing perfectly, Martin's taunting, his crossing the barrier, and the guard's sudden, commanding response. By evening, it would have millions of views. Back at his post, James maintained his position, facing forward with perfect composure. His fellow guards had witnessed everything. They knew how hard it was to follow protocol exactly when provoked. Too little response could be dangerous. Too much would cause an international incident. James had nailed it. For the rest of his 2-hour shift, Tourists whispered as they passed. Some gave him respectful nods. A few parents pointed him out to their children, explaining something about respect and dignity. James kept his eyes fixed ahead, but he heard everything. At the police station, Martin sat scrolling through his phone, seeing the first comments appear under the video that was now trending. "What an idiot!" Perfect response from the guard. Why do people think they can mess with the guards? Martin's friends had been allowed to join him in the waiting area. They weren't laughing anymore. "My mom's going to kill me if I get charged with something," Martin said, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "Why'd you have to take it so far?" his friend Tom asked. "That wasn't cool, what you said to him." Martin didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know why he'd done it. Something about the guard's stillness, his dignity, had made Martin want to break it. An officer came in with paperwork. "You're being fined for disturbing the peace and crossing a security barrier," she explained. "You're lucky the palace isn't pressing more serious charges." "Will this go on my record?" Martin asked, suddenly worried about his job back home. "That depends on whether you pay the fine and stay out of trouble for the rest of your visit," she said. As the paperwork was being processed, an older gentleman in civilian clothes entered the room. He introduced himself as Captain Richards, explaining he was an officer in the same regiment as the guard Martin had harassed. "I'd like you to understand something," Richards said, sitting down across from Martin. "The men and women who serve as the Queen's Guard aren't just there for tourists. They're elite soldiers. Lance Corporal Okonkwo has served in combat zones. He's protected diplomats in high-risk areas. The discipline you saw today isn't an act, it's who he is." Martin looked down at his hands. "I messed up." "Yes, you did," Richards agreed. "But how you behave after making a mistake matters too." Back at the barracks that evening, James finally relaxed after his shift. His fellow guards clapped him on the back. "Handled like a true professional," his sergeant said. James smiled. "Just did what we're trained to do." His phone buzzed with messages from family who had already seen the video. His mother's text simply read, "Your grandfather would be proud." James looked at the message for a long moment. In a job where you had to remain expressionless for hours, you learned to hold your feelings inside. But now, in the privacy of the barracks, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Not because he'd embarrassed some foolish tourist, but because when tested, he'd done his duty perfectly. The next morning, Martin woke up with a pounding headache in his hotel room. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. The video had gone viral overnight, and now people from his hometown were tagging him. Even his boss had sent a message asking if it was really him in that guard video. "This is a nightmare," he groaned, burying his face in the pillow. Tom threw a towel at him. "Get up. We're supposed to visit the Tower of London today." "Are you joking?" "I can't show my face anywhere in this city." "Hiding in the hotel won't make this better," Tom said. "Besides, nobody will recognize you if you just wear your cap and sunglasses." Reluctantly, Martin got dressed. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe the best thing was to just carry on with their trip and let the whole thing blow over. Across town, James was starting his day with a 5-mile run. He always ran before breakfast, no matter the weather. The rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement helped clear his mind. Yesterday's incident wasn't the first time someone had tried to provoke him during duty, and it wouldn't be the last. His phone rang just as he finished his route. It was his mother calling from Birmingham. "James, you're famous," she said when he answered. "Your cousin showed me the video." "Over 2 million views." James smiled. "Just doing my job, Mum." "Your dad says the morning papers are talking about it too. Something about maintaining the dignity of the guard and all that." James hadn't expected the story to get this much attention. He was just following the exact protocol they'd drilled into him during training. One stamp to alert, shoulder the rifle, issue the warning. He wondered what had happened to the tourist who'd tried to touch him. At the Tower of London, Martin kept his head down. He'd worn a different jacket and had his hood up despite the warm weather. Every time someone looked his way, he felt sure they recognized him. The tour guide was explaining something about ravens when Martin's phone rang. It was his mother. He stepped away from the group to answer. "Martin, please tell me that's not you in this video I'm seeing all over Facebook," she said without even saying hello. "Mum, I can explain." "What were you thinking? Your father and I didn't raise you to behave like that." Martin closed his eyes. The disappointment in her voice was worse than the fine or the public embarrassment. "I know, Mum. I messed up. I had too much to drink and—" "That's no excuse, and you know it," she cut him off. "Those guards deserve respect. And the things people are saying you said to him." "I'm ashamed, Martin." The call ended with his promise to apologize and make it right somehow. But how exactly was he supposed to do that? The palace wouldn't let him anywhere near the guards again. That afternoon, James had a meeting with his commanding officer. He'd been told it was routine after any incident involving a guard and a member of the public. What he didn't expect was to see several senior officers waiting for him. At ease, Okonkwo, his CO, said, "We've reviewed the security footage from yesterday." James stood straight, hands behind his back, waiting for whatever came next. "Your response was textbook perfect," the colonel said, surprising James with a smile. "In fact, we'd like to use the video for training purposes if you have no objection." "No objection, sir." "The timing of your response, the clarity of your warning, exactly as it should be done. Not too aggressive, not too lenient." James felt a quiet pride. In the guards, praise didn't come easily. "There's something else," the CO added. "We've had media requests for interviews with you. The public seems quite taken with how you handled yourself." James frowned slightly. "I'd prefer not to, sir. Any guard would have done the same." The colonel nodded, seeming pleased with this answer. "That's what I told them you'd say. Good man." As James left the meeting, he checked his phone again. His younger brother had texted, "Big bro, you're trending. #respect the guard is all over Twitter." James shook his head. All this fuss over him simply doing exactly what he was trained to do. Still, if it helped people understand and respect the guards a bit more, maybe some good would come from it after all. 3 days after the incident, Martin sat in a small cafe near Hyde Park, staring into his coffee. The trip that was supposed to be fun had turned into a disaster. His friends had gone to see the changing of the guard, without him, of course. He couldn't go near Buckingham Palace again without feeling sick to his stomach. "Mind if I join you?" Martin looked up to see an older man with grey hair and a kind face. Something about him seemed familiar. "Do I know you?" Martin asked. "No, but I know who you are," the man said, sitting down without waiting for permission. "I'm William. I served in the Queen's Guard for 27 years before I retired." Martin's face flushed red. "Look, I don't need another lecture." "Not here to lecture you, son," William said, raising a hand. "Just thought you might want to understand a bit more about what those men and women do." Against his better judgment, Martin found himself listening. "That young man you confronted, do you know what he did before he earned that red coat? 2 tours in the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan. Saved 3 of his mates during an ambush. Nearly lost his leg doing it." Martin looked down, shame washing over him again. "I don't know that for sure about Lance Corporal Okonkwo specifically," William continued, "but I know that's the caliber of person they select. These aren't toy soldiers. They're among the best in the British Army." "I get it," Martin mumbled. "I was an idiot." "Yes, you were," William agreed, surprising Martin with his bluntness. "But you're not the first tourist to be an idiot, and you won't be the last. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Meanwhile, back at the Wellington Barracks, James was cleaning his boots to a mirror shine. No matter how many times they'd been polished, they were never perfect enough. That was the guard's way. Excellence in every detail. His fellow guard, Raj, was reading something on his phone. "You're still viral, mate," Raj said with a grin. "They're calling you the immovable object." James rolled his eyes. "They'll forget about it in a week." "The colonel won't," Raj said. "Word is, you're being considered for promotion ahead of schedule." James paused his polishing. A promotion would mean more money to send home to his mother. After his father's death 2 years ago, she'd been struggling to make ends meet. "I just followed protocol," James said, returning to his boots. "That's why they're considering it," Raj pointed out. "You kept your cool when most would have lost it. That tourist was saying some proper nasty stuff." James had tried not to think about the actual words the man had used. Growing up in London, he'd heard it all before. His father, who'd immigrated from Nigeria in the 1980s, had taught him that the best response to prejudice was excellence. People who talk like that, his father had said, they want you to react, to lose control. Don't give them that power. At the cafe, Martin was still talking with William. "I've been thinking about writing a letter or something," Martin said, "to apologize properly." William nodded slowly. "That's a start, but you know what might be better? Understanding why you did it in the first place." The question caught Martin off guard. "I was drunk, showing off." "Maybe," William said, "or maybe there's something about a man standing perfectly still, showing perfect control, that made you want to break that control." Martin thought about it. There was some truth in what the old man was saying. Something about the god's dignity had made him feel smaller somehow. "I've never met anyone with that kind of discipline," Martin admitted. "It made me feel, I don't know, like I needed to prove something." William smiled sadly. "That's the thing about the god. Standing still for hours isn't just physical discipline, it's mental. It's about believing in something bigger than yourself." As evening fell, James finally got off duty and checked his personal phone. Among the many messages was one from an unfamiliar email address. The subject line read, "An apology from the tourist." James hesitated before opening it. He'd already put the incident behind him. Did he really want to revisit it? Curiosity won out. He clicked on the message and began to read. "Dear Lance Corporal Okonkwo," it began. "You don't know me, but I'm the person who disrespected you and your uniform 3 days ago. There's no excuse for my behavior, but I wanted you to know how sorry I am." James read the entire message twice. It seemed genuine. The writer had taken time to reflect on his actions and the impact they'd had. "Well," James said to himself, "that's unexpected." He wasn't sure if he would reply. Some things were better left in the past. But the apology itself meant something. It meant that sometimes doing your duty properly could change more than just your own life. Back in his hometown, Martin slouched on his parents' couch, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. It had been 2 weeks since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and the video was still circulating. Someone from his old high school had even messaged him, "Dude, is that really you getting schooled by that guard?" Martin's father walked in, coffee mug in hand. "Still wallowing?" "I'm not wallowing," Martin mumbled. "Just catching up on stuff." His father sat down beside him. "Your mother and I have been talking. We think maybe this whole thing happened for a reason." Martin groaned. "Please don't turn this into some life lesson." "Hear me out," his father said. "Remember your grandfather? The stories he used to tell about serving in the army." Martin nodded reluctantly. His grandfather had been a proud military man who'd served in his younger days. He passed away when Martin was 14. He used to say that respect wasn't just about being polite. It was about recognizing someone else's dignity, their worth. Martin put his phone down. "Dad, I get it. I messed up." "That's not what I'm saying," his father insisted. "I'm saying maybe this is a chance to think about why you did what you did. Your grandfather would have been the first person to call you out on this." The words stung because they were true. Grandpa Joe had been strict about respect, especially for those in uniform. "I don't even know why I did it," Martin admitted. "It just happened." His father sighed. "Things don't just happen, son. We make choices." Later that night, unable to sleep, Martin found himself looking up information about the Queen's Guard. He'd never bothered to learn anything about them before the trip. They were just tourist attractions to him, men in funny hats. What he found surprised him. The guards weren't ceremonial figures hired to stand around for tourists. They were elite soldiers from some of Britain's oldest and most decorated regiments. Many had seen combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones. Martin clicked through photos of training exercises, combat deployments, and ceremonial duties. These men and women lived a life of discipline he could barely imagine. Across the ocean in London, James was having dinner with his family. His mother had prepared a special meal to celebrate his handling of the incident. "The colonel called me himself," his father said proudly, passing the rice. "Said you were a credit to the regiment." James's younger brother grinned. "My friends at school all saw the video. They think you're famous now." "It's really not a big deal," James insisted, uncomfortable with the attention. "Any guard would have done the same." His mother shook her head. "Not everyone would have kept their composure like that. Your grandfather would have been so proud." James glanced at the old photo on the wall, his grandfather in his military uniform from the 1960s. As one of the first black soldiers in his unit, he'd faced challenges James could only imagine. Yet he'd served with dignity, passing down a legacy of pride and discipline. "I wish the tourist hadn't been so disrespectful," James's sister said. "Some people just don't think before they act." James considered this. "Maybe he's never had to stand for anything important," he said finally. "Standing guard isn't just about staying still. It's about honoring something larger than yourself." The next morning, Martin woke up with a clearer head than he'd had in weeks. The shame was still there, but something else too, a determination to do better. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to the Royal Guards Regiment. He had no idea if anyone would ever read it, but he needed to write it anyway. "To whom it may concern," he began, "my name is Martin Wilson, and I was the tourist who disrespected one of your guards 2 weeks ago." He wrote about his grandfather's military service, about how ashamed he knew his grandfather would have been of his behavior. He apologized not just for the disrespect to Lance Corporal Okonkwo, but to the uniform and tradition he represented. "I can't take back what I did," Martin wrote, "but I wanted you to know that it's changed how I see things. I'm enrolled in a community service program now, trying to find ways to stand for something worthwhile myself." Before he could second-guess himself, Martin hit send. He had no expectation of a response. It was enough just to put the words out there. That same day, James was informed that his actions had earned him a commendation. His commanding officer handed him the official letter. "We've also received numerous messages of support from the public," the officer mentioned. "People appreciated seeing the proper protocols followed so precisely." James accepted the commendation with a quiet "Thank you, sir." As he walked back to the barracks, he thought about the tourist. There had been a moment, just before the man crossed the line, when James had seen something in his eyes, not just mockery, but something deeper. Insecurity, perhaps. A need to prove something. James wondered what had happened to him after being escorted away. Had the incident changed anything for him? Or had it just been another funny story to tell his friends back home? Some questions didn't have answers. All you could do was stand your ground and do your duty. The rest was beyond your control. 3 months had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace. Autumn leaves crunched under Martin's feet as he walked through Green Park, hands stuffed deep in his pockets against the chill. London looked different to him now, less like a playground and more like a city with history and meaning. After returning home, Martin had found himself unable to forget what happened. The video had eventually faded from social media, but the memory stayed fresh in his mind. Back in his small town, people had teased him at first, then simply moved on to the next bit of gossip. But something had changed inside Martin. He'd started reading about the Queen's Guard, about their training and history. He'd watched documentaries about the regiments. And slowly, a plan had formed in his mind. That's why he was back in London now, alone this time. He had used some of his savings for the flight, telling his parents he needed a short holiday. They'd looked at him strangely but hadn't questioned it. Martin checked his watch. He had an appointment to keep. Across town, James was enjoying a rare day off. He sat in his sister's kitchen, playing with his 4-year-old niece, who was trying to teach him some complicated clapping game. "You're terrible at this, Uncle James." She giggled as he missed another sequence. "That's because you keep changing the rules," he protested, making her laugh harder. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from his captain. Don't forget, 2 p.m. at the coffee house. The tourist who wanted to apologize. Stilloke to meet him. James had been surprised when his commanding officer had approached him about this unusual request. Apparently, the tourist, Martin, had gone through proper channels, writing to the regiment and requesting a brief meeting to apologize in person. Such requests were almost always denied, but something about the sincerity of Martin's letters had made an impression. "It's entirely up to you," the captain had said. "No obligation whatsoever." James had thought about it overnight before agreeing, not out of any desire for an apology. He'd moved past the incident long ago, but from curiosity. What kind of person travels back to another country just to say sorry? At 1:55 p.m., Martin sat at a corner table in the small coffee shop near Wellington Barracks. His palms were sweating despite the cool air. What if the guard didn't show up? What if he did, but refused to accept the apology? What if Martin couldn't find the right words? The door chimed, and Martin looked up to see a tall man enter. Out of uniform, in jeans and a simple jacket, James looked different, more approachable, but still carrying himself with the same quiet dignity. Their eyes met, and Martin stood up awkwardly, knocking his knee against the table. "Lance Corporal Okonkwo," Martin began formally, extending his hand. "James is fine when I'm not on duty," he replied, shaking Martin's hand firmly before sitting down. There was an uncomfortable silence as the waitress came to take their orders. Martin fumbled with the menu, eventually ordering a black coffee. James asked for tea. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Martin finally said when they were alone again. "I know it's unusual." James nodded. "Very. May I ask why it was so important to you?" The email apology was more than most would do. Martin stared at his coffee for a moment. "I couldn't let it go," he admitted. "Not because of the video or the embarrassment, but because I've never done anything like that before, and I couldn't understand why I did it." James raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I think I was jealous," Martin said, the words coming out in a rush. "Of your discipline, your purpose. You stood there so certain of who you are and what you're doing. I've never felt that certain about anything in my life." The honesty of the answer seemed to surprise James. He took a sip of his tea before responding. "That certainty comes at a cost," he said quietly. "Years of training, sacrifice. The discipline isn't just for show, it's because lives can depend on it." Martin nodded. "I understand that now. I've been reading about the guards, about what you actually do beyond the ceremonial duties." They talked for nearly half an hour, not as friends exactly, but as two people trying to understand each other across a gulf of different experiences. Martin explained how the incident had forced him to confront prejudices he hadn't even realized he carried. James shared a little about his journey to becoming a guard, though he kept most details private. As they prepared to leave, Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small donation receipt. "I made a contribution to the Guards charity in your regiment's name," he said. "It's not much, but I wanted to do something concrete, not just say words." James looked genuinely touched by the gesture. That was thoughtful. The charity helps veterans and families of fallen soldiers. They parted with another handshake, knowing they would likely never meet again. As Martin watched James walk away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had come seeking forgiveness, but had found something else too, a new understanding of respect, dignity, and what it meant to stand for something larger than yourself. A year had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace. On a crisp spring morning, a school bus pulled up outside the palace gates. 30 excited 10-year-olds poured out, chattering and pointing at the famous building. "All right, settle down," called their teacher. "Remember what we talked about. We're here to observe the changing of the guard, and I expect everyone to be respectful." Among the parent chaperones was Martin. He now volunteered regularly at the local school, something he never would have considered before his London trips. The kids called him Mr. Martin and seemed to enjoy his jokes and stories. "Mr. Martin, is it true you met one of those guards?" asked a boy with glasses too big for his face. Martin smiled. "I did. And that's why I know how important it is to show them respect. They're real soldiers, not just men in fancy uniforms." The class gathered at a good viewing spot, the children fidgeting with excitement. Martin found himself scanning the guards, wondering if James might be among them. He knew it was unlikely. Guards rotated duties and postings, but he couldn't help looking. The ceremony began, the precision of the movements capturing even the most restless children's attention. Martin felt a familiar sense of awe watching the perfectly synchronized marching and the expressionless faces showing such incredible discipline. "They don't even blink," whispered a little girl. Across the palace grounds, inside the guardroom, James was adjusting his uniform before going on duty. Now a sergeant, he had additional responsibilities training new guards. His promotion had come through 6 months after the incident with Martin, just as Range had predicted. Okonkwo called his superior officer. "There's a school group out there today. Keep an eye on them, mostly well-behaved, but you never know with kids." James nodded. "Yes, sir." As he marched out with several other guards to take their positions, James spotted the children right away. What he didn't immediately notice was the adult standing with them until something about the man's posture caught his attention. Their eyes met for just a moment as James marched past. Recognition flashed between them. Martin gave a small, respectful nod. James's face remained perfectly impassive, but there was the faintest acknowledgement in his eyes. Later that afternoon, as the children boarded the bus, one of them asked, "Did you see that guard looking at you, Mr. Martin?" "Guards don't look at anyone," another child argued. "They're not allowed to move their eyes." Martin smiled. "They see everything, actually. They're just trained not to show it." On the bus ride home, as the children sang songs in the back, one of the other parents slid into the seat next to Martin. "You seem to know a lot about those guards," she said. "I was impressed with how you explained everything to the kids." Martin looked out the window at London passing by. "I learned the hard way that there's a lot more to those soldiers than most people realize." Back at the barracks, James was filling out some paperwork when Raj stopped by his desk. "Wasn't that the guy from the video, with the school group today?" Raj asked. James nodded. "Looks like he found a better way to spend his time." "Small world," Raj commented. "Ever think about how different things might have been if he picked another guard to harass that day?" James considered this. "I think he would have gotten the same response from any of us. That's the point of the training, consistency." That evening, Martin sat in his backyard looking at photos from the trip. He paused on one that showed the palace guards in the distance. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. How was the field trip? "Good," he typed back. "The kids loved it." He hesitated, then added, "I saw him, the guard from the video. He's been promoted." 3 dots appeared as his mother typed her response. "Funny how life works out. That moment you're most ashamed of ended up changing you for the better." Martin thought about that as the evening light faded. One stupid decision, made for all the wrong reasons, had sent ripples through his life in unexpected ways. He'd learned about respect, about discipline, about admitting when you're wrong. He'd even started volunteering because of it. Meanwhile, across London, James was calling his mother. "Remember that tourist from the viral video?" he asked her. "I saw him today. He was chaperoning a school trip." "Well," his mother said, "people can surprise you." James smiled. "They certainly can." As he hung up, James thought about how that one moment of doing his duty perfectly had affected his career, bringing recognition and opportunity. But more importantly, it had apparently helped someone else find a better path too. 2 lives, briefly connected through confrontation, had both moved forward, and maybe the world was just a little bit better for it.